The rope was already around her neck. The rough hemp scraped against her skin, a final, cruel touch in a world that had turned on her completely. The whole town of Cedar Ridge was out there, a sea of faces squinting in the harsh Texas sun. They weren't just watching, they were hungry for this, hungry for her death, and it was all because she'd made one simple mistake. She fell in love. She fell in love with the one man, the only man, she was ever supposed to hate. This is the story of Elizabeth Morrison, a woman with hair like spun moonlight and a heart too brave for the world she was born into. And this is the story of Ayanna, a Comanche warrior with eyes the color of a winter sky, who would ride through the gates of hell itself for the woman who saw him not as a savage, but as a man. Their story shouldn't have been possible. It shouldn't have ended this way. But it has a final chapter that nobody, not the sheriff, not her father, and certainly not Elizabeth herself, ever saw coming. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the gallows, before the betrayal, before the first stolen kiss by a creek that would change everything. The year is 1867. The air in Cedar Ridge is thick with two things: dust and hatred. The settlers who clawed this town from the prairie dirt live in constant, simmering fear of the Comanche, the ghost riders of the plains whose land this used to be. Every missing cow, every strange noise in the night is blamed on them. And the tension is a powder keg just waiting for a spark. In the middle of all this is Elizabeth. At 26, she's an unmarried woman in a town where girls are wives by 16. It's not for lack of offers. Men in Cedar Ridge look at her like she's a prize to be won, a beautiful porcelain doll to be put on a shelf. Her father, Samuel Morrison, who runs the general store, sees her as a commodity, a valuable asset he's frustrated he can't yet trade for a respectable son-in-law. But Elizabeth sees something else in the mirror. She sees a cage, a beautiful gilded cage made of expectations and calico dresses. Her spirit is as wild as the open plains she can see from her bedroom window, and she dreams of a life bigger than the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge. "Elizabeth, get away from that window," her father would bark, his voice rough as unsanded wood. "A woman of your particular looks needs to be careful. You'll draw the wrong kind of attention." The wrong kind of attention meant anyone who wasn't a land-owning white man. But to Elizabeth, the right kind of attention felt like a slow death. It was the leering gaze of Sheriff Marcus Webb, a man whose silver star couldn't hide the possessive rot in his soul. Webb wanted her. Everyone in town knew it. He saw her as the final piece of his little kingdom, the beautiful queen to his self-appointed throne, and his patience was wearing thin. One evening, unable to breathe in the suffocating air of the store, Elizabeth slipped out. She walked toward the one place she felt free, the creek that snaked behind the town, a ribbon of life in the parched land. The cottonwood trees whispered secrets to the wind, and the water murmured over stones. It was her sanctuary. She sat on a fallen log, closing her eyes, just listening. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, the soft nicker of a horse. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get back to the false safety of town. But a deeper curiosity, the part of her that yearned for the wild, held her frozen. Peeking through a curtain of willow branches, she saw him. He wasn't a settler. He wasn't a cowboy. He was a Comanche warrior. He was astride a magnificent paint horse, its coat a map of black and white patches. The man himself was breathtaking. He was tall, impossibly so, with a frame built of prairie muscle and desert sun. His hair wasn't black, as she'd always been told. It was a cascade of fiery red, unbound and flowing down his back, adorned with a single eagle feather that seemed to catch the last rays of the setting sun. But it was his eyes that stole the air from her lungs. They were the palest blue she had ever seen, like chips of ice, like the winter sky. He dismounted with a fluid grace that was more like a predator than a man, and as his horse drank from the creek, he looked up, his eyes locked with hers across the water. Time stopped. The world narrowed to the space between them, the hatred of their peoples, the years of bloodshed, the fear she'd been taught her whole life. It all evaporated in that single, silent gaze. He should have looked at her with hate. She should have screamed in terror. Neither of them did. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She saw strength. She saw intelligence. She saw a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. He took a slow step into the water, his moccasins sinking into the soft mud. He was breaking the unspoken boundary between them. He was coming for her. And the most terrifying part? She didn't move. She couldn't. He stopped in the middle of the creek, the water swirling around his buckskin-clad legs. And then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the very ground she stood on. The words he chose were not in his native tongue. They were in perfect, unaccented English. You are not afraid. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of surprise. Elizabeth found her voice, a whisper carried on the evening breeze. I should be. A slow smile touched his lips, transforming his harsh, beautiful face. Yes, he said, taking another step closer. You should. The world was spinning, a Comanche warrior, speaking perfect English, looking at her not like an enemy, but like he'd been waiting for her his entire life. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting them in the fiery glow of twilight, two impossible people from two warring worlds, standing on the edge of a precipice. What would you have done? Would you have run? Or would you have stayed, drawn in by the mystery in those ice-blue eyes? This one decision, this single moment of choosing curiosity over fear, was the pebble that started an avalanche. An avalanche that would either bring them together or bury them both. Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind of everything she'd ever been taught. Savages, raiders, killers. That's what her father called them. That's what Sheriff Webb preached in the town square. Yet the man standing before her, radiating a quiet power she'd never witnessed, seemed anything but. Are we enemies then? She asked, the words bolder than she felt. He considered this for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like he was reading the pages of her soul. The sky and the earth are not enemies, he finally replied, his voice a low baritone. But they can never touch. Our peoples are at war. That does not mean we must be. He moved out of the water, stepping onto her side of the creek. He was so close now she could see the intricate beadwork on his clothes, smell the scent of sage and leather, and the open plains that clung to him. What is your name? She asked, a breathless whisper. I am called Ayana, he said. It means eternal blossom in the language of my people. Elizabeth, she offered, her own name sounding plain and dull in comparison. Elizabeth, he repeated, and the way he said it was like music. He tasted the syllables, giving the name a beauty she had never heard in it before. A beautiful name for a woman with the sun in her hair. A blush crept up her neck. No one had ever spoken to her like that. The men in Cedar Ridge offered clumsy compliments about her looks, but this was different. He spoke like a poet, a warrior poet from a world she couldn't imagine. How do you speak English so well? A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of a pain so deep it startled her. When I was a boy, the bluecoat soldiers raided my village. They took several of us children. They sent us to their schools, far away. They cut our hair. They beat our language from our tongues. They tried to make us forget we were Comanche. The casual cruelty of it made Elizabeth's stomach clench. But you came back. Yes, he said, his jaw tight. My heart could not live in a cage of brick and wood. It belongs to the plains. But I learned your language. I learned your ways. Perhaps I learned too much. He looked at her then, and she understood. He learned enough to know that not all of his enemies were the monsters he'd been taught they were, just as she was learning the same thing right now. The distant sound of a dog barking from town broke the spell. The reality of their situation came crashing back in. I have to go, she said, her voice laced with a regret that shocked her. If anyone saw us, they would call you a traitor, he finished for her, his voice grim, and they would hunt me down like an animal. The stakes were laid bare between them, death, for both of them. Yet still, she lingered. Will I see you again? The question tumbled out before she could stop it, a desperate plea from the part of her that had just woken up. Ayana stepped even closer, his shadow falling over her as the last light faded. He was so tall, she had to crane her neck to look up at him. Would you want to? Her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. Every ounce of sense, every rule she had ever lived by, screamed at her to say no, to turn and run and never look back. But as she looked into those endless blue eyes, she saw a reflection of her own caged soul, and she knew she couldn't walk away. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but he saw it. "Then we will meet again," he said softly. "But you must be careful, Elizabeth. The hatred between our peoples is an old, bitter root. It will not be easily pulled from the earth." As if on cue, a shout echoed from the direction of town, followed by the angry clamor of men gathering. It was the nightly patrol, the one Sheriff Webb organized to hunt for Comanche raiders, to hunt for men like Ayanna. "I must go," she repeated, finally gathering her skirts. "As must I," he said, turning toward his horse. But before he swung himself into the saddle, he looked back at her, his face a mask of stone in the gathering dark. "Elizabeth." She stopped, her hand on her heart. "Be safe," he said. It was a simple phrase, but in it, she heard a universe of meaning. It was a warning, a plea, a promise. She fled back toward the suffocating safety of Cedar Ridge, her mind reeling. She didn't just talk to a Comanche warrior. She had connected with him. She had felt a pull toward him that was more powerful than fear, more potent than prejudice. She felt more alive than she had in her entire life. As she slipped back into her small, lonely room, she could still feel the warmth of his gaze, still hear her name on his lips. She knew she was playing with fire, a fire that could consume her and everything she knew. But for the first time, she didn't care. She felt the thrill of danger, the promise of a love that defied the world. Little did she know, they hadn't been entirely alone by the creek. Hidden in the tall grass, a pair of young eyes had watched the entire exchange. Young Billy Henderson, a boy desperate to prove himself a man in the eyes of the town, had seen it all. And a secret in a town like Cedar Ridge is a dangerous thing. It's a currency, and Billy was about to spend it. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets. Elizabeth and Ayanna met by the creek whenever they could, always under the cloak of twilight. With each meeting, the walls between their worlds crumbled a little more. He told her stories of the great buffalo herds, of a life lived in harmony with the land, a life of freedom she could only dream of. She, in turn, told him about her own prison, about the suffocating expectations and the loneliness of being seen, but never truly known. She learned that his people were starving. The settlers had slaughtered the buffalo, their source of life, for sport and for hides, leaving the plains littered with rotting carcasses. The cattle raids the town was so enraged about were not acts of aggression, but acts of desperation by a few young warriors trying to feed their families. Ayanna did not approve, but he understood their pain, their anger. He was a leader among his people, a war chief, struggling to find a path of peace in a world that only offered war. The attraction that had sparked between them at first sight had now grown into a deep, consuming love, a love that was as beautiful as it was impossible. "Come with me," he urged her one night, his hands tangled in her moon-white hair. "My people are preparing to move to the winter camps in the north. Come away from this place. Be my wife. Be free." The offer was a lifeline, a beautiful, impossible dream. To ride away with him, to leave Cedar Ridge and its hatred behind forever. But she saw the reality behind the dream. "Your people would never accept me," she whispered, her heart aching. "I would be a constant reminder of the world that is destroying them. They would see me as a threat, a spy, and they would see you as a traitor for bringing me into their camp." He couldn't deny it. He knew she was right. The hatred was a poison that had infected both sides. "Then what do we do?" he asked, the stoic warrior's composure cracking to reveal the desperate man beneath. "I cannot live without you, Elizabeth." "And I cannot live without you," she replied, tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "But we also cannot live with each other." They were trapped, suspended between two worlds that refused to touch. They continued their secret meetings, stealing moments of happiness, knowing that each one could be their last. They were living on borrowed time, and they both knew the clock was ticking. Meanwhile, in town, the atmosphere was growing uglier. Sheriff Webb, fueled by the whispers and rumors that young Billy Henderson had started to spread, was becoming more aggressive, more paranoid. Billy hadn't named Elizabeth directly. He was savoring his power. But he'd spoken of a woman with hair like corn silk meeting a Comanche warrior by the creek. Webb knew exactly who that was. His obsession with Elizabeth curdled into a dark, possessive suspicion. If he couldn't have her, no one would, especially not a Comanche savage. He started watching her, his eyes following her everywhere she went. He saw the new light in her, the life that had sparked in her eyes, and it enraged him. One afternoon, he cornered her in the store while her father was in the back. "You've been looking happy lately, Elizabeth," he said, his voice a low, threatening drawl. He blocked her path, trapping her between a barrel of flour and his own imposing frame. "A woman like you needs a husband to look after her, to keep her safe from dangerous ideas." "I'm perfectly safe, Sheriff," she said, her voice colder than ice. "Are you?" he pressed, leaning closer. "There are traitors in this town, people who sympathize with the enemy. When I find them, I will make an example of them, a very public example." His eyes bore into hers, and the message was clear. He knew, or at least he suspected. This wasn't a warning, it was a promise. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The cage was shrinking. The walls were closing in, and Sheriff Webb was holding the key. She knew then that this couldn't go on. She had to end it with Ayanna. Not just for her own safety, but for his. If Webb caught him, he wouldn't just kill him. He would make it a spectacle. That evening she went to the creek with a heart made of lead. She had to say goodbye to the only man who had ever truly seen her. She had to break her own heart to save his life. But when she arrived, he wasn't there. She waited as the sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire. He never came. A cold dread, sharp and painful, began to creep into her heart. Had he been captured? Had something happened? Just as she was about to give up hope, she heard hoofbeats. Not the silent approach of Ayanna's paint horse, but the heavy, clumsy thud of shod horses. It was the patrol, and they were riding hard, heading straight for her. At their lead, silhouetted against the dying light, was Sheriff Webb. He had set a trap, and she had walked right into it. "Well, well, well," Webb sneered, reining his horse to a halt just feet from her. His deputies fanned out, their rifles glinting in the twilight. "Look what we have here. Waiting for someone, Elizabeth?" Her blood ran cold. This was it, the end of the line. She had been so consumed by her love for Ayanna, she had become reckless. She had underestimated the depths of Webb's obsessive hatred. "I was just taking a walk," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "A walk?" Webb dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stalked toward her, his face a mask of triumph. "Young Billy Henderson told me everything. Told me about your little rendezvous with a Comanche murderer. You've been feeding him information, haven't you? Telling him our patrol routes, our defenses." "That's a lie," she cried, a genuine outrage in her voice. "We just talked." "Talked?" Webb let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You expect me to believe that? A decent white woman and a filthy savage? I know what you were doing down here." His eyes roamed over her body in a way that made her feel sick. "And now you're going to tell me everything you know. You're going to help us set a trap for your lover. And if you don't," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper, "I will personally see to it that every man, woman, and child in this town knows you for what you are. A traitorous whore who sleeps with the enemy." The world tilted on its axis. He was giving her a choice, but it wasn't a choice at all. Betray Ayanna and live with the shame, or refuse and be destroyed by the lie. She thought of Ayanna's ice-blue eyes, of his gentle strength, of the love that had set her free, and she found her answer. She lifted her chin, meeting Webb's hateful gaze without flinching. Her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "I would rather die," she said. Webb's face contorted with fury. He had expected her to crumble, to beg. He raised his hand, the urge to strike her clear in his eyes. But then a sound cut through the tense silence. an arrow. It sliced through the air with a vicious thwip and embedded itself in the dirt just inches from Webb's boot. Everyone froze. Webb and his deputies spun around, their eyes wide with panic, frantically searching the darkened trees. Another arrow struck, then another, coming from all directions. They weren't aimed to kill, but to terrify, to herd. It was Ayanna. He hadn't missed their meeting. He had been watching, hidden, protecting her. He had seen the patrol arrive and had sprung his own trap. "It's an ambush!" one of the deputies screamed, firing his rifle blindly into the woods. Chaos erupted. The settlers, so confident just moments before, were now a panicked mob. They were on Ayanna's territory, in his world of shadows and silence, and they were completely outmatched. Ayanna's war cry echoed from the trees, a terrifying, beautiful sound that made Elizabeth's heart leap. He wasn't alone. The cries were answered from other directions. He had brought warriors with him. In the confusion, Elizabeth saw her chance. She turned and ran, not back toward town, but deeper into the woods, away from the gunfire, toward the sound of Ayanna's voice. She heard Webb scream her name, a sound of pure, thwarted rage, but she didn't look back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, stumbling over roots and through thorny bushes. Finally, she burst into a small clearing, and he was there. He stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, his bow in hand, his face grim. He caught her as she stumbled, his strong arms a circle of safety in a world gone mad. "I told you to be careful," he breathed into her hair. "You came for me," she sobbed against his chest. "Always," he said, his voice fierce. He held her for a moment, then pulled back, his eyes urgent. "We have to go. Now. My warriors are leading them on a chase, but it won't last forever." He led her to where his paint horse was hidden. He swung himself up and then pulled her up behind him. It was the first time she had ever been so close to him, her body pressed against his strong back, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. It felt more right than anything she had ever known. "Where are we going?" she shouted over the thunder of the horse's hooves. "North," he replied, his voice carried back on the wind. "To the winter camps, to our new life." They rode through the night, leaving Cedar Ridge and the life Elizabeth had known far behind. She looked back once at the distant pinpricks of light that marked the town, her prison. There was no sadness, no regret, only a profound sense of release. She was riding into an unknown future, a life that would be hard and filled with challenges. But she would be with Ayanna. She would be free. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, she leaned her head against his back, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. She had chosen love, and love had saved her. But in Cedar Ridge, Sheriff Webb was nursing a wounded arm and a shattered pride. He had been outsmarted, humiliated by a Comanche warrior and the woman he thought he owned. His hatred, once a simmering coal, now burned like a forge. He looked out at the faces of his defeated deputies, at the fear in the eyes of the townspeople, and he knew exactly what he had to do. He couldn't let them get away. He would hunt them. He would use this incident to whip the town into a frenzy, to demand military action, to start a war he knew he could win. He wouldn't just get Elizabeth back. He would eradicate Ayanna and his people from the face of the earth. The escape was not the end of their story. It was just the beginning of the war. A war for their love and a war for their lives. The journey north was a baptism by fire. Elizabeth, who had never spent a night outside the wooden walls of her father's house, was now a fugitive on the open plains. The world was a brutal, beautiful canvas of endless sky, sweeping grasslands and biting winds. Every day was a lesson in survival, taught by the most patient and capable teacher she could have imagined. Ayanna showed her how to find water, how to read the tracks of animals, how to listen to the language of the wind. She shed her calico dress for soft buckskin, her thin shoes for sturdy moccasins. The soft-handed storekeeper's daughter was stripped away, layer by layer, revealing the resilient, strong woman who had always been underneath. She saw a new side of Ayanna, too. Not just the gentle lover who whispered poetry in the twilight, but the war chief, the leader of his people. He was respected, almost revered, by the warriors who rode with them. He was wise, strategic, and at times ruthless in his determination to protect his own. She saw the heavy burden of leadership he carried, the weight of his starving people's future resting squarely on his shoulders. Her love for him deepened, evolving from a romantic dream into a profound and solid respect. After 2 weeks of hard riding, they finally reached the Comanche encampment, a sprawling village of hide teepees nestled in a valley protected from the harsh winter winds. The reception was exactly as Elizabeth had feared. The people stared at her with open hostility and suspicion. She was the enemy. Her hair, so admired in Cedar Ridge, was a beacon of her otherness here. They saw her as a bad omen, a white woman who had brought nothing but trouble, forcing their war chief to expose his warriors to danger for her sake. The elders were particularly cold. They confronted Ayanna in a tense council meeting, their voices sharp with accusation. They accused him of thinking with his heart, not his head. They argued that her presence put the entire tribe at risk. The settlers would not let her abduction go unanswered. They would send soldiers. A war was coming, they said, and she would be the cause of it. Ayanna stood before them, resolute and unyielding. "She is not our enemy," he declared, his voice ringing through the council lodge. "She has a Comanche heart. She chose us over her own people. I have chosen her as my wife. She is one of us now, and we will protect her as we would any of our own." His words and the sheer force of his conviction silenced some of the criticism, but not the suspicion. Elizabeth knew she would have to earn her place here, prove that she was not a threat. She threw herself into the work of the camp, learning from the other women. She learned to scrape hides, to sew with sinew, to gather medicinal plants, to cook over an open fire. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and capable. The work was grueling, but she did it without complaint, slowly, painstakingly, earning the grudging respect of the women. But her biggest challenge was a warrior named Kills in the Night, a man whose family had been massacred by soldiers. His hatred for all white people was a living, breathing thing, and he saw Elizabeth as a cancer in their midst. He had challenged Ayanna for leadership before and lost, and now he saw Elizabeth as a weakness he could exploit. He watched her constantly, his eyes filled with a venom that chilled her to the bone. He spread rumors, questioning her loyalty, suggesting she was a spy sent to learn their weaknesses before the army arrived. One evening, as Elizabeth was returning from the river, Kills in the Night cornered her. "You do not belong here, white woman," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You have brought a curse upon us. Ayanna is a fool, blinded by your pale skin. When the soldiers come, and they will come, it will be your fault." "I love him," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "And I love his people. This is my home now." "This will never be your home," he sneered. "It will be your grave." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. She knew he was dangerous. She knew he was looking for any excuse to turn the tribe against her and usurp Ayanna's position. The sanctuary she thought she had found was just another cage, with different bars. Here she wasn't judged for her looks, but for the color of her skin. The hatred she had fled in Cedar Ridge had found her again, just in a different form. Back in the world she had left behind, Sheriff Webb had gotten his wish. Using the story of Elizabeth's abduction and the unprovoked attack on his patrol, he had stoked the fires of fear and hatred into a raging inferno. He became a hero, the man who had tried to save an innocent white woman from the clutches of a savage. He petitioned the territorial governor, demanding retribution. The cavalry was dispatched, a full regiment of soldiers with orders to track down the Comanche responsible and pacify the region. Leading them, acting as their chief scout and guide, was Sheriff Marcus Webb. This was no longer just about the law. It was personal. He wasn't just there to punish the Comanche. He was there to get Elizabeth back and to put an arrow through Ayanna's heart himself. He tracked them with a relentless, obsessive zeal, his hatred a compass pointing him north. Weeks turned into months. Winter settled over the plains, blanketing the world in a pristine, deadly layer of snow. Life in the Comanche camp was hard. Food was scarce. The children were thin, their eyes large in their hungry faces. The mood grew darker, more desperate. Kills in the Night used the growing hardship to his advantage, whispering that it was Elizabeth's presence that had angered the spirits, that she was the reason for their empty bellies. Then one day, the scouts returned with dire news. A large column of blue-coat soldiers was moving toward their valley. They were less than 2 days' ride away. Panic erupted in the camp. The trap was closing. They were outnumbered and outgunned. To run would mean abandoning their winter supplies and likely starving in the open. To fight would mean annihilation. A final, desperate council was held. The elders were terrified. The warriors were divided. Kills in the Night saw his moment. He stood before the council and pointed a trembling finger at Elizabeth, who stood beside Ayanna. "This is the source of our troubles," he roared. "The spirits have abandoned us because our war chief has brought this white witch among us. Give her to the soldiers. Give them what they came for. Perhaps they will be satisfied and leave us in peace." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. People were scared. They were looking for someone to blame, a sacrifice to appease the approaching storm. Elizabeth's heart sank. She saw the fear and hatred in their eyes, the same look she had seen on the faces of the people of Cedar Ridge. But before Ayanna could speak, Elizabeth stepped forward. All eyes turned to her. She had been silent for so long, working, observing, learning. Now she found her voice. She spoke not in English, but in the halting, yet clear Comanche she had painstakingly learned over the winter. "It is true that the soldiers have come because of me," she began, her voice ringing with a surprising strength. "But they did not come to rescue me. They came to destroy you. The man who leads them, Sheriff Webb, does not want me back. He wants me to be an excuse to wipe you from this land so that his people can have it all." She looked directly at Kills in the Night. "You speak of spirits, but the only curse here is the hatred in your own heart. It is the same hatred I saw in my own people, and it is a poison that will destroy you just as surely as it is destroying them. You say I am not one of you. You are right. I am not Comanche. I am not white. I am a woman who loves your war chief, and I will not be the reason his people die." She turned to Ayanna, her eyes filled with tears and a terrible resolve. "Let me go to them," she whispered, her words for him alone. "Let me talk to them. Maybe I can make them listen." "No," Ayanna said, his voice a raw wound. "They will kill you." "They will kill us all if we do nothing," she replied. "You have taught me to be brave. Let me do this." Before he could argue further, Kills in the Night let out a triumphant shout. "She admits it. She wants to go to them. She is a spy, a traitor." He lunged for her, a knife suddenly appearing in his hand. But Ayanna was faster. He moved like lightning, intercepting the attack. The two men crashed to the ground, a whirlwind of buckskin and fury. The council erupted into chaos. Warriors drew their weapons, some siding with Ayanna, others with Kills in the Night. The tribe was about to tear itself apart from the inside, with the army just over the horizon. Elizabeth watched in horror. This was it, the end of everything. Kills in the Night's hatred had finally ignited the spark that would burn them all to ashes. But as the two men wrestled in the dirt, their grunts and curses echoing in the lodge, Elizabeth saw something that made her blood run cold. As Kills in the Night's tunic was torn in the struggle, she saw a glint of metal on a chain around his neck. It wasn't a piece of Comanche jewelry. It was a silver dollar, a brand new, shiny American silver dollar, the kind you couldn't find on the open prairie, the kind you could only get in a place like a general store. Her mind flashed back to the weeks before she left Cedar Ridge. Her father had complained about a string of petty thefts from the store. Small things, tobacco, a knife, and a handful of new silver dollars that had just arrived in a shipment. He had blamed it on some drunk cowboy. But now, seeing that coin on Kills in the Night's chest, a horrifying new possibility took shape in her mind. A truth more twisted and betrayed than she could have ever imagined. What if the traitor wasn't her? What if the enemy wasn't just outside the camp, but had been inside it all along? "The coin!" Elizabeth screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The coin around his neck!" Ayanna, momentarily distracted, glanced down. He saw the glint of silver. In that split second of confusion, Kills in the Night gained the upper hand. He twisted, bringing his knife up, aiming for Ayanna's heart. But Elizabeth moved without thinking. She grabbed a heavy stone fire starter from the hearth and brought it down with all her strength on Kills in the Night's head. He crumpled, unconscious, the knife clattering to the dirt floor. Silence descended on the council lodge. Everyone stared, first at the unconscious warrior, then at Elizabeth, panting, the stone still clutched in her hand. Ayana slowly got to his feet. He knelt beside his rival and pulled the silver dollar from his neck. He held it up for all to see. "Elizabeth is right," he said, his voice deadly calm. "This is a white man's coin. It is new." He looked around at the stunned faces of his people. Kills in the Night has not been to a settlement in 10 years. So where did he get this? The implication was horrifying. Kills in the Night hadn't just been spreading dissent. He had been communicating with the enemy. He had been the one feeding information to Webb. Not about defenses, they had none, but about their location, their desperation. He had betrayed his own people, hoping the army would destroy Ayana, leaving him to pick up the pieces and become chief. The cattle raids, the escalating tensions. It was all him. A long, calculated plan to seize power. And Elizabeth had been the final, perfect pawn in his game. The tribe looked at the unconscious man with new eyes, filled with disgust and horror. And then they looked at Elizabeth, the white woman who had just saved their chief's life and exposed the true traitor in their midst. In that moment, something shifted. The suspicion in their eyes was replaced by a dawning respect. She had proven her loyalty not with words, but with a fierce, desperate act of love. But there was no time for celebration. The truth had come at a terrible price. They now knew for certain that their enemy was not just coming. They were being led directly to their doorstep. The army was almost upon them. Ayana stood before his people, the grim reality of their situation settling over them like a winter shroud. They were trapped. Kills in the Night's betrayal meant the soldiers knew the valley's layout, their numbers, their desperation. A direct fight was suicide. Fleeing into the blizzard was a slower, but no less certain, death. It was Elizabeth, her mind racing, who saw the third option, a crazy, desperate gamble that was born from her knowledge of both worlds. "Webb doesn't just want to win," she said, her voice urgent as she spoke to Ayana and the elders. "He wants to be a hero. He wants a spectacle. He's arrogant. We can use that against him." Her plan was audacious. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. They wouldn't fight the army head-on. They would lure Webb into a trap of his own making. For the next day, the entire camp worked with a frantic, unified purpose. The warriors under Ayana's command prepared not for battle, but for a performance. The women and children, led by a now respected Elizabeth, gathered every spare piece of hide, every blanket, and began constructing dozens of empty decoy teepees on the far side of the valley. From a distance in the swirling snow, it would look like the camp was twice its actual size. They built elaborate fortifications, but not at the mouth of the valley where an attack was expected. Instead, they built them deep inside, in a narrow, treacherous canyon filled with loose rock and deadfall. It was a place no sane commander would lead his troops. But Elizabeth knew Webb was not sane. He was driven by ego and obsession. As the sun rose on the second day, the army appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley, a long, dark line of blue against the white snow. At their head on a black stallion was Sheriff Webb, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. The soldiers started down the slope, their bugle call echoing off the canyon walls, a sound of impending doom. The Comanche camp appeared quiet, almost deserted. This unnerved the army commander, a cautious veteran, but Webb would hear none of it. "They're scared," he spat, his eyes wild. "They're hiding, ready to surrender. I want the war chief, and I want the woman. We go in now." He spurred his horse forward, forcing the commander's hand. The cavalry charged into the valley. They galloped straight past the real camp, which was hidden in a grove of pine trees and made for the larger decoy village. As they drew closer, they saw it was deserted. It was a ghost town. Webb screamed in frustration, realizing he'd been tricked. At that moment, a single rider appeared on the ridge leading to the narrow canyon. It was Ayana, on his magnificent paint horse. He sat there, a lone warrior against an entire army, a deliberate, defiant target. "He's mine!" Webb roared, all strategy forgotten. He broke from the main column, galloping toward Ayana, a handful of his most loyal men following. The rest of the cavalry, confused but bound by orders, followed them toward the canyon. Ayana held his ground until the last possible second, then wheeled his horse around and disappeared into the narrow passage. Webb, blinded by rage, charged in right after him. The cavalry followed, the canyon walls pressing in on them, the horses struggling on the uneven, icy ground. This was the trap. Once the bulk of the regiment was inside, the warriors who had been hiding on the canyon rims unleashed hell. Not with arrows or bullets, but with rocks and logs. They started an avalanche. A thunderous roar filled the air as tons of snow, rock, and debris cascaded down the steep walls. The soldiers screamed. Horses panicked. The orderly column disintegrated into a chaotic mass of death and terror. The avalanche wasn't designed to kill them all, but to block the canyon at both ends, trapping them, breaking their charge, and turning their greatest strength, their numbers, into a fatal weakness. In the chaos, Webb fought his way through the tumbling rocks, his eyes still fixed on his prize. He saw Ayana waiting for him in a small clearing deeper in the canyon. This was it, the final showdown. He drew his pistol and charged. Ayana knocked an arrow, but before either man could strike, a third figure stepped out from behind a rock. It was Elizabeth. "Webb, it's over!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. Webb reined in his horse, his face a twisted wreck of confusion and fury. "Elizabeth, I've come to save you. Get away from him." "I don't need saving," she said, her voice like steel. "And you didn't come here to save anyone. You came here to kill, to satisfy the hatred in your own black heart." "He brainwashed you," Webb screamed, raising his pistol, his aim wavering between Elizabeth and Ayana. "But I'll fix that. I'll kill him, and you'll thank me for it." "No," Ayana said, stepping in front of Elizabeth, his bow steady. "It ends now." But it wasn't Ayana's arrow or Webb's bullet that ended it. From the rocks above, a figure rose. It was Kills in the Night. He wasn't dead. Elizabeth's blow had only stunned him. He had woken up to the shame of his betrayal, seen the army he had summoned, and in a final, desperate act of redemption, he had followed them into the canyon. He held a single rifle, likely one he'd bartered for with his silver dollars. He wasn't aiming at Ayana. He was aiming at Webb. "You will not destroy my people," he screamed, his voice raw with anguish. He fired. The shot rang out and Webb jerked in the saddle. A dark red stain blossomed on his chest. He looked down, his expression one of pure shock. Then he toppled from his horse and lay still in the snow. The soldiers, their leader dead, their escape route blocked, completely demoralized, had no fight left in them. The veteran commander, seeing the tactical nightmare he was in, sounded the retreat. The Comanche let them go. They didn't want a massacre. They just wanted to survive. Ayana and Elizabeth stood over Webb's body, the snow around him slowly turning crimson. The war was over. The man who had hunted them, the man who had embodied all the hatred of the world they'd left behind, was gone. They returned to their people not as conquerors, but as survivors. The tribe, united by the battle and by Elizabeth's bravery, finally and truly accepted her as one of their own. She was no longer the white woman. She was Ayana's wife, the savior of the people. Their life was never easy. The world was changing, and the time of the free roaming Comanche was coming to an end. But they faced that uncertain future together, their love a bond forged in fire and tempered by impossible odds. They had built a bridge between two worlds, a sanctuary not of land or of walls, but of the heart. Elizabeth Morrison was sentenced to die for loving the enemy, but instead she had saved him, saved his people, and in the process found her own salvation. Her story proves that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to love in spite of it. It proves that sometimes the greatest wars are not fought with guns and arrows, but with a stubborn, unbreakable heart that refuses to bow to hatred. If you've ever felt like you were trapped between two worlds, judged for who you love, or forced to fight for your right to be yourself, then you understand the heart of this story. It's a tale from the Old West, but its truth is timeless. Have you ever had to choose between your heart and what the world expected of you? Have you ever been willing to risk everything for a love you knew was right? If these questions echo in your soul, if you believe that one person's courage can change the world, and that love is a force more powerful than any army, then you've found your tribe right here. Every time you hit that subscribe button, you're casting a vote for love over hate. You're standing with Elizabeth and Ayanna and declaring that stories of impossible courage deserve to be heard. You're saying that hearts like yours deserve a community. If you're ready to explore more stories that will push the boundaries, that will challenge your beliefs, and that will make your own heart beat a little faster, then subscribe now. Because just like Elizabeth found her true home in the most unexpected of places, maybe you'll find a piece of what you've been searching for right here with us. Don't let this moment pass. Your heart knows the way. Subscribe and let's see where the next story takes us.